Hi, everyone. I'm Gordon Happ with Red Hat, and this is definitely the meta entry on the software packaging discussion this afternoon. I will mention that I'm moving through things quickly today, but this is actually based on a book that I co-wrote with one of my colleagues last summer. I have some cards with pointers to the free ebook. And if anybody on the stream or anyone else would like to kind of point their search engine at Gordon Haff, look for BitMason, there's a free download link on the site. So when we started out with computers, in fact, with things in general, we really didn't have packaging. In this case, the old IBM accounting machine, you had to wire things up individually. And in fact, this sort of thing lasted for a long time. We were sewing rope core memory in the Apollo 11 guidance computer. So basically, every piece of hardware you needed to program individually. Now, over time, outside of a little bit before computers, we created packaging. Initially, it was probably leaves and straw and things like that. The earliest packaging with pots was about 20,000 years ago. So in China, the earliest pots discovered, so long before what we would call civilization. And of course, over time, we came up with forms of packaging in the computer industry as well. And these are some of the most common ones, but I'm guessing there have been something like hundreds, maybe even thousands of formats of magnetic tape and other type of removable media over the years. And one of the things that this brought us, in addition to the fact that we could replicate software and move it from place to place, was it allowed things like the ISV industry to be created. One great piece of trivia that I have to share that I ran across in researching my book for this is that you can argue that the first ISV was Syncom in about 1968. That company is still running with one of its founders as the CEO, which I thought was both neat and kind of cool. So ISV, so this is getting to another use of packaging. You think about packaging as a way to have transactions, to start to standardize things a bit. A lot of those early pots and baskets and so forth really weren't very standardized. But you get to about the time of the Romans or so, and they even had a standard amphora, that's what these pots are, up in one of the temples, and that was the standard measurement. And it was some number of liters. I think this is actually the wrong number, but it was a standard measurement. And of course, this being Belgium, I have to introduce beer kegs as yet another type of example of this, but obviously just about any field you can imagine has its own variant of this, whether it's barrels, whether it's steel drums, whether it's just anything. You have this set of highly standardized software isn't the only ones who aren't good at standardizing. And of course, beer kegs are useful for other things after you've drunk the beer. Now, this is all sort of almost utilitarian use of packaging. And if you take sort of the next step forward, products, any kind of product that consists of multiple components, multiple parts, is really a form of packaging. You have options, but you don't pick and choose the nuts and bolts that go into a car. And Henry Ford sort of popularized, drove the assembly line in automobiles. I sort of like this slide. IKEA buys GM. Probably a little unfair with the founder of IKEA passing away over the last week. And in fact, IKEA is really very much, of course, a product itself. It's just it's not an assembled product, but it's a product that is brought together to deliver certain characteristics to consumers, predominantly price and ease of transport. And of course, the trade-off, as there often is in packaging, is you optimize for certain things. In the case of IKEA, you're optimizing for price, you're optimizing for being able to take the thing home in your car. You're not optimizing for the ease of getting things set up at the other end necessarily. And the other aspect of packaging and really products in general, most of you have probably heard of the Mythical Man Month by Fred Brooks, who had popularized the term the Mythical Man Month. This is the idea that adding more engineers, more developers to a late project makes it even later because you need to bring the people up to speed, there's communication overhead and so forth. But he actually opens up this book with a different idea that if you look at going from a program and in an open source context, you might actually be able to think of this as an open source project to a complete product. It goes along two different axes. And you have more effort on each of those axes, and from at least the perspective of the IBM System 360, that was about 9x effort. And of course, software products bring a lot of things together as well. If you were here earlier, Langdon talked about distributions. Distributions are one form of that. So are all the other things that commercial software companies such as myself do. Product testing, documentation, support, all that other kind of thing that turns something like an open source project into something that typical enterprises are going to use. Products also bring together all these other pieces in the retail industry, including a certain amount of verification. This has the FDA label, which is, I'm not quite sure what the equivalent in the EU is, but it's basically, these are the contents here, these are what nutritional information is, along with some instructions on how to use it and so forth. But there's, of course, just because you write something on a label doesn't make it true. These are some early patent medicine labels, which took the US a little while to outlaw as false advertising. The other thing you see is how this sort of informational aspect has evolved over time, because if you looked at early general stores, this was largely a self-service operation. You went to the clerk, they pick things out for you. Hey, what's in here? They tell you. And it wasn't really a self-service, stores weren't really self-service, so you didn't need to do a lot of labeling. But in the United States, as we got to grocery store consolidation and so forth, stores got larger, self-service. You can see the contrast here, where suddenly there's a lot more information available provided by the package so that you can use it directly as a user. And, condensed milk, corn flakes, Hills Brothers coffee, really lousy Budweiser beer. All these are all things that, labels and packaging developed over time. And in fact, you listen to a Coca-Cola bottle, and if you're a kind of a marketing person who deals with these things, there's all kinds of cues and things about that bottle that are part of the experience. And with software as well, a lot of the experience is outside of, strictly speaking, the narrow product. So you'll have things like books and blogs, and probably could even throw meetups in there, conferences, what have you, is all part of creating a product experience. One of the most interesting recent developments here is an increased effort in making the software itself self-documenting. And either within the product itself, or things like Ansible playbooks, for example, are effectively a way to make a product document itself, install itself, check dependencies, that kind of thing. If we go beyond the product, and this is kind of sort of bring this home, there's also this idea of bundling, where the product doesn't stand alone along with its dependencies. And one of the aspects of bundling, which I think is actually sort of famous and notable in this era, is the newspaper bundle. A newspaper, a historical printed newspaper was, well, to some degree is, still an effective bundle. It had the investigative journalism, it had the classified ads, it had the sports score, you could use it to line bird cages when you were done with it, and so forth. They had a local monopoly, which is what sort of allowed this. And then what happened is things like Craigslist came in and go, oh, we'll take the classified ads and not even make money off of them because we don't care. And various other pieces started being carved off as well. The routine facts are no longer something that a newspaper can sell. And that bundle kind of started breaking down. By contrast, here's another bundle that has been kept together very, very much. I mean, almost famously so is Apple in terms of creating this bundled experience, and they have been able to keep it together because they control that hardware and people want that hardware. And really this, I think, kind of, the challenge here, I mean, everybody in this room is familiar with, and you probably have different views on the sort of the Apple bundle. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And, there's certainly one very valid point. These welded chassis are not really great things. And there's the other side, but it's a great user experience. And again, individuals may or may not agree, but those are the two sides. And I think when we think about open source software going forward against things like software as a service solutions in the cloud, this is really the challenge that we need to face. How do you preserve the freedom to tinker, the freedom to experiment in this world? And I would argue, and I'm picking one of my company's community projects here, OpenShift Origin, but I think as a general principle, I think open source does have this potential, through thinking about distribution, through thinking about packaging, some of the things Langdon was talking about, others have been talking about in terms of how we make the packaging experience in Linux and in open source software projects more generally better, to bring those things together into polished platforms, into polished distributions, into polished whatever you want to call them, while still retaining the ability to say, oh, I'm going to use a different CI/CD system than Jenkins. I'm going to use a different orchestrator than Kubernetes, and so forth. And I think as we look forward, I mean, this is, from my perspective, one of the central things that open source projects, the open source communities need to think about. This idea of SaaS aggressively bundling, giving you the power, the power of convenience, as a former analyst colleague of mine, Stephen O'Grady, has called it, while taking advantage of the open source unbundling. So getting that smooth experience, but with the capability to have that freedom to tinker with the software and take in the direction that you want it. So thank you.
Thanks for your talk. There's 1 minute for questions.
One question if anyone wants. No? Good, great, thank you. I do have some cards with a book link if anyone wants it up here.